In a democracy, citizens need to be informed. Informed about policies, issues, homelessness, law enforcement, and social services. In order for people to make good decisions that affect their lives, they need to be informed. Conversations with Erroll Parker. Tsehai, S.E.B. Farrell, is the author of a thrilling, poignant spiritual novel in part about her experiences with former Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie and his family. She is here to discuss her book that takes you back and brings you forward in a very fascinating journey. Welcome to the program, Tsehai.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, Erroll.
It's been a long time. Over 30 years ago, you were on one of my programs, and we were talking about, what was the subject?
It was my workshop and book called Tour, the Transformation of Race,
That's
Resolving the Internal Dilemmas.
Okay, you remember that.
I do.
But this is a different book,
Yes.
Tsehai.
Yes.
Give us a brief synopsis of this book.
So this book is really two parallel love stories. It's historical fiction, and one is a modern day love story that takes place between a young woman from Watts and one of the Emperor Haile Selassie's grandsons. And the other one is the beginning of the lineage of kings in Ethiopia, which is the son of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. And so it's their son, Menelik, was the first king of Ethiopia. So really you have two love stories, one at the beginning of the reign of kings in Ethiopia and one at the end of the reign of kings. So you just kind of get to see that even though it's thousands of years, there are common things in love, common things in history, common spiritual things that go on.
What's the significance of this book?
I think it's here in the subtitle. The title of the book is Woven into the Fabric, but the subtitle is Into the Very Fabric of Our Lives, God has woven spun gold. And so that just says there are things that we experience in life, people, ideas, places that are a part of the eternal fabric of life. They're timeless. They're eternal. And so for encouraging people to listen for those things, to look for those things and those people in their lives, and to treat them like they are spun gold, like they're as precious as they are. So.
Why a fiction novel? Because this is historical fact, most of it.
Yes.
Well, why did you decide to write a fiction novel?
Well, it wasn't exactly a decision of mine like that. So I remember listening to Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and other authors over the years. When I was at Stanford, I was an English major, so you end up reading thousands of novels. And many writers, especially my favorite ones, kind of say that if you're lucky, at some point, the book starts writing itself. The characters start having their own opinions, their own words, like you're not telling them what to say, they're telling you. And so
That's interesting.
It is. And so I always thought in the back of my mind, that's very fascinating. So as I was writing this book, the second year I was writing it, I was at the beach and I had finished writing for the morning, and I was sitting there and I heard a voice, and the voice said, I am with the Creator from the beginning. I am given patterns and sets of living strings. I am Destiny, the weaver. I said, that sounds fascinating. So I wrote it down. And little did I know, like a few days later when I was writing again, I was writing just my, it was a memoir. It started off as my story, just a memoir of meeting the emperor and how all that went. And but when I started writing, so it was a first-person narrative. I did this, I felt that. So when I started writing it after that voice, I was calling myself she. And I was thinking, why am I referring to myself in the third person? And so then, but I had taken a writing workshop with the wonderful author Dina Metzger. And she had said to us, and I had taken it to heart, that strange things might happen in the process of writing your book, but you just need to trust the process. So now that I cannot write I anymore, that I have to call myself she, this was one of those strange things. So I said, but trust the process. So I says, let me just let this play out and see how this writing in the third person is going to work. So I just allowed it to happen. And maybe months later, I realized, because I couldn't tell who is the narrator. But once that third person narrator took over, that is when the Queen of Sheba, as a young woman, just before her coronation as the Queen of Sheba, she came into the story. So that's exactly how she got in. And I'm trying to figure out, as the writer, who is this? And it wasn't until her mother and father said her name, Makeda, that I said, oh, that's the young Queen of Sheba. Okay, we're on a journey here. So that's how I felt as a writer. I'm on a journey here. And so I realized maybe within a year that Destiny was now the weaver of this story. And I said, okay. So Destiny is the narrator of the story.
Let's digress for a minute. You were Miss Watts 1968?
1971.
1971. And that catapulted you, the people organizing the event, that catapulted you in meeting Haile Selassie. Tell us about that encounter.
It did. So let me just backtrack just a little bit, because this is also a spiritual tale, like in reality a spiritual tale as well. Because I remember my freshman year at Stanford, I'm walking across campus. There's a huge church on campus called Memorial Church, and it has a mural at the top of the church when you're, just on the outside, and the sky in the mural is gold. So I'm walking across campus one day, and the sun, it's in the middle of the day, the sun hits the mural, and it kind of like makes me glint like that for a second. But as soon as I do that, I hear a voice, and it says, "You're going to Africa."
Just like that? Just
like that. And it was like, whoa. But it felt like I was going to Africa. And even though I was just 17, I was kind of always a spiritual person. So I kind of knew that voice, and I kind of knew that when I heard from that particular voice, that it was probably the truth. And I also knew that I didn't really have to know how yet. And so my boyfriend at school, I told him about it. He said, okay, we need a plan. So this is our our freshman year, so our sophomore year we'll take a year of Italian. Then our junior year, we'll go to Stanford in Italy, and they're cheap flights from Florence, Italy to Sierra Leone. So I just kind of quickly prayed and said, is that it? I didn't get an answer, and he was so happy about it and excited. I said, okay, let's do it. So we took a year of Italian, but when it came time to go, when I prayed about it, it came back no, so I didn't go. But
so you were following the voice.
I was following the voice, just following the guidance. It was like, okay. So now he's there. This is now the late spring of our junior year. He's there. He's, in fact, in Sierra Leone, just like he planned. And it's so funny because now we've lived all these years, and that's the kind of person he turned out to be, the one that plans his life, and he actually done all the things that he said he would. And so he sent me gifts, this African fabric and these African pictures, when he was there. And so I'm dressing up in all this African fabric and prancing around, having fun. And then I thought about, why don't I feel bad? Because he's there, I'm not. And it just felt like, that just feels like it's not my trip. And so when I folded the stuff up finally, that voice that I heard 2 years before came back and said, exactly the same way, you're going to Africa. But it added, soon. So I said, soon? Hadn't connected anything, but a few months later I was at this post office on campus, and the woman who works in the post office said, we got a letter here. I think it's for you, but it's kind of your name is spelled wrong. I said, yeah, everybody spells my name wrong. And I said, well, let me look. I said, is it from LA? Yeah. I said, it's probably for me. If it's not, I'll bring it back. And it was a strange letter because it was from a woman, Mrs. Johnson, very common name. And she said, you don't know me, but I've been, you went to Fremont. I saw articles about you getting scholarships at Stanford. And, your family was from Watts. I think you'd be a good Miss Watts. And she sent me an application for Miss Watts. So I prayed about it, and it just said, yeah. And
you wound up winning.
I wound up winning, but had no idea, because one of my older sisters, I had 3 older sisters, had been a Miss Watts, the second Miss Watts.
That's right.
So I had a up close, Miss Watts was community service. And Miss Watts she went to New Orleans, and she went to San Francisco and San Diego, but mainly it's community service. And so that's when I agreed to run, because of this strange, woman sending me the application. That's like, okay, so I can do this. I can do this for the years, like feeling like community service. But once I got involved in the pageant, it was 2 weeks before the pageant until they announced the prize for Miss Watts, and they said, and the grand prize for Miss Watts is an all-expense paid trip to 5 African countries as the guest of the heads of state. So that was Haile Selassie, Jomo Kenyatta, Nyerere, Gowon, and Ashampong at the time.
How fascinating.
How fast. And it was like, soon as they said that, because it was late at night when she announced it, the voice came back and said, that's your trip. And so I knew I was going to win, because that was my trip.
Well, tell us about meeting with Haile Selassie.
So when I got there, and I just wanted to mention, when I asked about, oh my God, all these fancy things on my itinerary, I don't have clothes. I'm a senior in college. And she turned the program. Disneyland's costume department is making your wardrobe for the trip. So everything was
falling
fine.
in place.
So now I go, and we're at the Jubilee Palace, which is a true palace. I never thought about palaces in Africa, but here we were. And I had 2 companions traveling with me. And so we went in, and Dr. Talbert was teaching us the protocol for meeting the emperor. So we were curtsying and called him Your Majesty, and all these things. And so they came to get us. But when the guard came to get me to have audience, they said, His Majesty would like to see Miss Hayes, which is my maiden name, alone first. And I said, Dr. Talbert? And he said, go ahead. So I went, and there he was. You walk into this huge room, and there's a throne. And there he is. And
did you have to pinch yourself, say, this is really happening?
It was like, I'm just walking, and I'm just trying to really, what was on my mind is, don't mess up your curtsy. That was really what was on my mind. Don't be awkward. Don't be awkward. So, I went, I did my little curtsy, and then, he laughed. And just as I was about to curtsy, he extended a hand. So, we were both trying to accommodate each other. So we started talking, and then he had someone bring me a chair. So he sat on his throne, I sat in the chair. And it just felt like it was an odd feeling, because it felt like I knew him. I knew I'd never met him, but spiritually it just felt like, I know you. And we were laughing and talking, just having a wonderful time. But there was a point in the conversation, he said, so, Miss Hayes, where are your people from? I said, Texas, Arkansas. He said, no, I mean, where in Africa are your people from? And I said, well, Your Majesty, with slavery and everything, we don't really know where we are.
And how did he take that? Well, hold your point. We got to take a break.
Okay.
I want to know how he responded to that.
Yes.
I'm sure he responded in a very interesting way.
Yes, he did.
We'll be right back with Tsehai S.E.B. Hayes, who is the author of a book called Woven in Fabric, right after these messages.
Okay.
In a democracy, citizens need to be informed. Informed about policies, issues, homelessness, law enforcement, and social services. In order for people to make good decisions that affect their lives, they need to be informed. Conversations with Erroll Parker. We are visiting with Tsehai S.E.B. Farrell, not Hayes, and she's the author of a book called Woven into the Fabric. And she was just talking about, we were digressing a minute, but we were just talking about her meeting with the great emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie. And he asked you a question where your folks were from, and you said Arkansas in the South.
Texas, yeah.
And he says, no, what part of Africa? So,
Yes.
so tell us about that.
So then I said, I felt a little uncomfortable, a little embarrassed that we didn't know where we're from. But I just said, well, just tell him the truth. I said, Your Majesty, with slavery and everything, we don't really know where we're from. I mean, I don't know. And he says, Miss Hayes, I know where you're from. And I said, where? And he just looked me direct. He said, you're from the royal lineage of the house of Judah, from my house. and I know my own anywhere. And I was 21. It just like my mind just said, pew.
Wow.
I mean, and in an odd way, it felt it was true, but I didn't know how it was true. And then he just said, and we just have to make the adjustment. And he sit back in his throne like that. And I said, I wonder what all this means. And so at some point, we talked for about an hour, and then I remembered my companions. I said, Your Majesty, and he brought them in. So at the end, he gave me a bracelet, and it had the first I've ever heard of spun gold. It was spun gold braided with giraffe tail hair, and then it had the Ethiopian crown on it and a seal. And so what I didn't know at the time was that's a bracelet worn, he wears one, and worn by the royal family. And so I didn't know he had given me that. And I mean, I knew he'd give me that, but I didn't know the significance of it. And so he gave my companions, I had 2 companions, a cross. And then as we were leaving, he called me, we got to the door and he called me back, you know, Miss Hayes, come back. And I came back and he said, I have a surprise for you. And I said, but Your Majesty, the bracelet and all the things you've done for me. He says, no, someone to meet. And I said, yeah. And he said, yeah. He said, you'll get a new itinerary in the morning. He said, you'll like them. I said, well, Your Majesty, I like you so much, I know. He said, no, you have to come back and give me a report. And I said, I will. So when we got the new itineraries in the morning, we had about 4 more days there. And so it was 2 different envelopes. One was for me, one for my companions. And we had all these wonderful, exciting things on our original itinerary for these 4 days. But when I got mine went down to 4 o'clock that day and nothing else. And 4 o'clock that day, and theirs was still full with all the things. Meeting with His Royal Highness, and that was his grandson. And then nothing else. And I asked my companions, who were all both older, what does this mean? And he said, well, looks like you might be set up, you know. So we went down to breakfast with some people, and I said, well, how old is the prince? And they said, he's 18. Well, when you're 21, someone's 18.
And you're a woman.
He's a senior in high school. I'm a senior in college.
That ain't gonna work.
That's not gonna work. A child, that's what I thought. He's a child. But when we went, you know, the next day to actually meet him, and he was also a duke, and when we went to actually meet him, he was not a child. He was probably like 27.
Oh, really?
And he was like probably the most handsome man I'd ever seen before. And so it was like, oh gosh, I'm in so much trouble. So at any rate, as life would have it, we ended up, before the story played out, we were engaged. So, yeah.
What was the hardest chapter that you had to write in this book?
There was a chapter that I struggled with, and it's a chapter called A Courtyard in Harar. And it's a chapter that takes, it was hard to write because the experience itself, it was based on a real experience that I had. So 30 years after I went back to Ethiopia for the first time, because there was a coup in Ethiopia that ended the relationship. They were imprisoned, the royal family and everything. But 30 years later, I went back to Ethiopia, and we went actually to the palace of the Duke of Harar, which would have been our home. And we toured that palace. I was with a group of Stanford Alumni Travel Study Club. And it was so hard touring that palace, which would have been our home, and it's now a museum, that emotionally it was just so difficult. And I remember going out to one of the side, like it's probably one of the storage rooms for the cook, and being there and looking out into the courtyard, which was dry, and the palace was shabby, but in my spirit I kind of saw children. I knew they weren't real, but 4 children playing. 4 children playing. And when they looked up, the oldest one, he was about 7, had the face of his father, which would have been my husband. So I knew I was in a strange zone. I knew it was like an imaginary something happening there. And then there was another son, and then there was my daughter, who's my real daughter. She was 3, and then there was a baby in a walker and 2 nurses out there with the children. And so just for that brief moment, I said, I don't know what this is, but I would like to kiss my kids. So it was like, I didn't know what it was, but I just asked, can I? You know, and so it felt like this was an alternate me, because whoever the me was, when I looked down, she was pregnant. So I kind of communicated with her, and she went out and she hugged my oldest son, and she looked him in the eyes, and she kissed his cheek, and she said, I love you. And he said, I love you, Mommy. So I got to do that through her with each of my children that were never born, except for one. And then I said, if only I could see him. And he walked past the door, and he looked out at us, me and the children. And so then, after that experience was over, everything turned back to normal, and it just felt like somewhere in time they lived, like in an alternate universe. They lived, and they had this family, and there was something in me that it felt like it healed. So when I had to write that chapter, the hardest part was writing that intersective moment when both versions of me realized that they were present at the same place. And the younger version felt what the older version of me needed, and she conceded. She stepped back in her spirit and let the older version take over and experience the children. And that was like one of the kindest gestures that I had ever felt.
You sound like you were really at peace there.
It was lovely. It was so sweet. It was so lovely. But the writing of it was so, it was so difficult to catch that moment just right, but I actually did, so.
My sister wanted me to ask you this question. In your view, does this book speak to a cultural imperative and or a spiritual historical journey? Does it?
It does, and I think it speaks to both, because I think the spiritual part, I was just on book tour in Atlanta the week before last, and this group of women that had selected my book back in January to read for September actually flew me out because they were experiencing it, they loved it. And so once we had we were having the talk I was sharing, at the end they had questions, and one of the women said, wait a minute, Tsehai, wait a minute. I live a wonderful life, but it's a regular life. So she said, and there's so much magical things, there's so much high spiritual things. I want magic. How do I get magic in my, and so I think that's one of the gifts of the book, is that it takes you on a journey that is both real, but it's, I think on the back it says it's magical realism, because it crosses these spiritual lines where, and I think that's probably the invitation of me and the invitation of the book, is that we're more than these bodies, we're more than the circumstances in our life, that we are magical at our core. We're magical, and let us, pick up those magical gifts and use those magical gifts, because I think that is what really will save our lives.
You answered the question I was going to ask, and you just answered it, but are there any future books that you have in your soul that you want to write?
Well, this took me 21 years to do.
My goodness.
And actually, I can say that I've told the story many times, but now that I've written it, the writing is much better than the telling. That there's one of our very prolific writers, Eric Jerome Dyson, said, to me, he read the book and he has a quote on the back, and he said to me, Tsehai, this book, you're a writer's writer, because it's just really well written, and so for 21 years I just had this, and Spirit had said to me 2 years in, finish the book is the bridge to the rest of your life. So it's like, I will have to finish this book, because if God said the rest of my life is over here, I have to write a book to do it. I can't imagine not writing it and just thinking, what would that have been like over there and so I did it. And so now I'm in the rest of my life that was divinely created by God. And so, I'm talking to you, and that means you're in it too.
Uh-oh.
This divine.
I want royalty. Last question. If you were to talk to some young authors, and I had you to talk to one in the green room, what would you tell a young author who is trying to write a fiction novel similar to what you're doing?
I would ask them to. I have a feeling that even fiction, like in my case, it's inspired by real events. So usually there's something animating an author from the inside. And probably those are the authors that I would talk to, like somebody that just wants to write a book because I want to write, like, I'm not really the teacher for them. But for ones who something inside of them says to do this, then trust that. First of all, trust that. And then know that, just get out a notebook and just start. Like, what do you already know about this story? And maybe all you know is the title, a working title. Maybe all you know is, yeah, it's going to be about this, it's going to be about this. So just start flushing out and putting on paper what you already know, and you'll be surprised because it's already living in you, and it wants to come out. And if you don't find a time, and the time could be, when I first started writing the book, I only wrote Wednesday evenings. So you pick the time, Saturday mornings between 6 and 8 a.m., whatever you pick. But once you pick it, be faithful to your writing, because otherwise you would be one of those people who would have to write on napkins because your writing tries to get out whenever it can. But if you give it a place, then it will serve you well. Just sit down, and even if you think you have nothing to write, just honor whatever time you said you devote. Other than that, your writing will be homeless. Yeah, so.
The name of the book is Woven into the Fabric, and the author is Tsehai, S.E.B. Hayes, or S.E.B. Farrell, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I've been knowing her for eons. That's why I say Hayes instead of Farrell. Thank you so much, S.E.B., for sharing with this audience the fascinating book you have. You ought to go get the book. It's really a fascinating read. And thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you so much.
And we'll see you next week with more exciting guests with Conversations with Erroll Parker. Good night. In a democracy, citizens need to be informed about policies, issues, homelessness, law enforcement, and social services. In order for people to make good decisions that affect their lives, they need to be informed. Conversations with Erroll Parker.